Hey everyone, welcome to my sewing and DIY channel. Today I am finally sharing that t-shirt refashion tutorial from my project back in 2020. Okay, it's a remake of that project. I don't have that t-shirt with me anymore. I left it in Singapore, but I made a second version. So in this video today, I'll be showing you my process of turning my husband's old t-shirt into a new retro style version for myself with no sewing pattern. When sewing the t-shirt, I also used a construction technique that helps me to avoid certain steps that I usually hate when it comes to sewing a t-shirt. Specifically, things like inserting the neckband into the neckline and inserting the sleeves into the armhole opening. So if those are the things that you hate when it comes to sewing a t-shirt as well, then you might find my construction technique a little interesting. Throughout the video, I will also be sharing my tips and tricks to sewing with stretchy fabrics with a regular sewing machine. So I don't have a serger or an overlocker. I've never touched one. Have I touched one? I've seen one, but I've never used one in my life. And every single garment that I've made that involves stretchy fabrics and elastics, they are all done with a regular sewing machine. So I'll be sharing what I have found really helpful to make the sewing process a lot less stressful when it comes to sewing stretchy fabrics with a regular sewing machine. Just look out for a pink box around the video for those tips and tricks. And if you're ready, let's get going! You need to start with a t-shirt that's larger. Try to find one from a family or a friend, or even combine a couple of your own old t-shirts to get enough fabric to make this one. You'll also need to identify a t-shirt in your wardrobe that fits you just the way you like. We're not using a sewing pattern, but we're using this t-shirt as a guide for cutting the fabric. For me, I'm using this white t-shirt as my pattern guide. First, cut the old t-shirt along the side seams so you can easily access the front and back pieces. Next, fold the front of the t-shirt in half lengthwise. Do the same with your fitted t-shirt and align them together along the hem and the center fold. Mark out the key landmarks of the fitted t-shirt. The key landmarks are the bottom of the neckline, which in this case is a very subtle V-neck line, the shoulder points, which in this case is a little bit of a dropped sleeve / cap sleeve kind of a design that I'm going for, the underarm point, and the bottom of the side seam. This is a little tricky with all the layers of the t-shirt, so take your time to do it. Do the same for the back piece. Fold the back of the old t-shirt and the fitted t-shirt in half lengthwise, then match them up along the hem and the fold, locate the landmarks, and cut. After cutting, your front and back pieces should look kind of like this. Now, since we're really just grossly cutting out the pieces, we'll need to check that both front and back pieces will fit together during the sewing process. Place the front and back pieces together along the shoulder seams and make sure that they're of the same length. Mine weren't the first time round, and I took the opportunity to cut up this extra little seam bit that kind of got included in the cutting process, and yeah, just basically took the chance and trimmed the shoulder seams. After checking the shoulder seams, check the side seams and make sure the front and back side seams are the exact same length. Don't throw the rest of the remnant pieces away just yet. We're going to need them to cut more pieces out later. And before we get into sewing, I just want to share a couple of tips that have helped me tremendously in making sewing knits with a regular sewing machine a lot less stressful. Use sewing needles designed for stretchy fabrics. These needles have tips that are sharp enough to pierce through the fabric, but also rounded enough to not snag the thread in the fabric. Now, I know a lot of you also hate the horror of having knit fabric stretch out when sewing. So when it comes to sewing stretchy fabrics with a regular sewing machine, sometimes I find that using a walking foot attachment really helps to reduce the pressure on the fabric and the likelihood of having the fabric getting stretched when sewing. For this project, I'm using my vintage Singer sewing machine, and with this machine, I actually have the luxury of reducing the pressure of the presser foot, so that's what I did instead. Now we're going to start by sewing one of the shoulder seams of the t-shirt. Place the front and the back of the t-shirt right sides together and sew just one of the shoulders together. It doesn't matter if it's the left or the right, the key is to sew just one of the shoulders. When it comes to sewing stretchy fabrics with a regular sewing machine, I use small zigzag stitches that look like this. They're narrow enough to kind of look like straight stitches on the outside, and the fact that they're zigzag actually allows the fabric to have a little bit of stretch. Next, we're going to go back to the cutting table and cut a length of 2-inch wide rectangle that's about 80% the length of the neckline. Okay, full disclaimer, I did this by just eyeballing, but if you want to be more precise, then what you need to do is to take your measuring tape, measure the length of the neckline, and then multiply that number by 0.8. The length of this neckband piece that I have is just enough for the circumference of my neckline that I have for this t-shirt. Usually when you are sewing a neckband, you do want it to be a little shorter so that it fits snugly and it sits right against your skin. If you don't have a piece of fabric that is long enough for the circumference of your neckline, you can consider two things. Number one, reduce the width of the neckband. So instead of cutting one 2-inch wide piece, maybe cut it in half lengthwise so that your neckband is narrower, but also the length of that multiplies by 2. Second option is to either find another piece of fabric in a similar color or get a fabric that's in a contrasting color just as like a cute accent and just embrace that design. Regardless of whether you're using a 2-inch wide or a 1-inch wide rectangle, press the neckband piece in half lengthwise so that we get a clean folded edge. Place the start of the neckband to the raw edge of the shoulder seams and sew the neckband all along the raw neckline, right sides together. This is like the super hacky way of doing it. It works. You're gonna see how it works. I think I'm gonna make it work. Now this part is a little tricky and I'll try my best to explain it. You'll have to pull the neckband gently as you go so that it becomes the same length as the neckline. Because the neckband is shorter than the neckline, the pulling helps to make sure that they end up being the same length. And in all honesty as well, I did have to unpick this part, so if it happens to you as well, just be assured that it's kind of common to mess up on this part. You will just really need a lot of patience to unpick the stitches, but it can be done. Moving on. Right after sewing the neckband on the neckline, your neckline is going to look a little wonky. Don't worry, it's going to be okay. Use a steam iron to press the neckline flat. Next, sew the remaining shoulder seam right sides together. At this stage, your t-shirt should look like this. Now we're going to head back to cut more pieces to complete the t-shirt. In the original t-shirt, I used the same construction technique of cutting long 2-inch wide rectangles and then pressing it in half and then sewing it to the armhole opening. For this t-shirt, I didn't end up with enough remnant pieces, so I decided to make use of the sleeves of the original t-shirt to make new sleeves. Just like I did with the hem of the t-shirt, I'm making use of the hemmed bit of the sleeves to save myself from a little bit of labor. I cut 2 pieces of 2-inch wide rectangles from the original sleeves of the t-shirt. The 2-inch includes the finished hem of the original sleeves. Next, sew the new sleeves to the armhole opening of your t-shirt right sides together. Start from one underarm point and make sure you finish at the other underarm point. Now don't forget to use the same technique of pulling the sleeve piece gently as you sew. I didn't actually make any actual measurement and I ended up with a little bit of extra length at the end of the armhole opening, but if you want a guide for cutting, then I'll say use the same formula of cutting a length that is 80% of the armhole opening. After sewing the left and right sleeves onto the t-shirt, press the armhole seams flat with the steam iron just like we did with the neckband. Next, Place the front and back right sides together and sew the side seams together. When it comes to sewing the side seams, I recommend that you do directional sewing. Always start from the bottom hem and then work your way upwards along the side seams to the underarms. This way you can make sure that even if you had accidentally stretched your fabric by just a little bit, they are both stretched in the same direction, and because the stretch is going upwards, you won't end up with the problem of having a t-shirt that seems to be hanging downwards. Also, I didn't quite like how the seam allowance along the neckline was kind of rolling up, so I decided to stitch it down in place with zigzag stitches from the right side of the t-shirt. I think this is the stage where people also use twin needles to sew the seam allowance down. I do have one in my stash, but I haven't actually had the time to test it out, so I decided to just stick to my tried and true method of using zigzag stitches. At this stage, you should have a totally functional and wearable t-shirt. But before I move on to the next step of adding that cute little pussy bow, I want to talk about fixing the neckline. I remember when I made the blue version, I actually had an issue of a gaping neckline. So if for some reason you have a gaping neckline as well, there is an easy way to fix it. What you need to do is to put the t-shirt on wrong side out and then see how much you need to take in by kind of just pinning and pulling like this. And then you need to stitch a little bit of a V and you get a fake V neckline, perhaps a V neckline that's even deeper. So if you look at my original version very carefully, you will see a line below the neckline stopping around here, and that's because I was sewing it to fix my slightly gaping neckline. Now we're gonna move on to sew that little pussy bow for our t-shirt. So to do that, you need to salvage whatever little remnant pieces you have and try to get a long piece of 2-inch wide rectangular fabric. If you have a short 2-inch wide rectangle, it just means that you have a shorter bow. If you have a longer piece, it just means that you have a bow with longer dangly bits. Fold this 2-inch wide rectangle in half lengthwise and sew them right sides together with a 3/8-inch wide seam allowance. Don't forget to leave an opening to turn the piece inside out. I decided to leave the opening on one end of the rectangle and actually sew the other end of the rectangle. I also did manage to turn this piece inside out with a little bit of trouble with the safety pin. Remind me to invest in a bodkin sometime in the near future. After turning the strip of fabric right sides out, I folded the seam allowance along the opening of the strip to the inside and stitched the opening shut by hand. Next, tie a simple overhand knot in the middle of this rectangle. You want the knot to be a little loose and you want the front-facing bit of the knot to have a square look. Hand sew the bow to the neckline right at the bottom of the V, and remember to also sew the dangling bits to the square knot in the middle so the bow doesn't get pulled or undone when you put your t-shirt in the washing machine. And that's it! You have just transformed an old t-shirt into a new t-shirt with a cute retro vibe. So I hope you've enjoyed this little thrift flip project. If winging it and sewing without a pattern is not your cup of tea, then I recommend that you check out my last video on 12 free t-shirt sewing patterns to see if you can find a pattern that fits your style and what you're looking for in terms of sewing a t-shirt. Leave a comment and let me know if you want to see more upcycle sewing projects. I am moving into the bodice module. Like in my head, I have this like modules that I want to go through. So the first project is this t-shirt project. The next couple of videos, I'm gonna start working on making blouses. Definitely gonna get started on my body sloper and try a couple of maybe historical sewing patterns. You gotta stay tuned to see. So I will see you in the next video for more sewing, DIY, and a little bit of fun. See ya! Bye!